Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Imagine, if you will, that you just created a setting for an epic high fantasy adventure, but now you want to tell a story that's a bit more gritty and realistic. Does that mean you need to create a new setting? Not necessarily. A grand and glorious heroic fantasy setting can host a dark urban fantasy story, assuming you set the story in a large metropolis. And a gritty post-cyberpunk setting can host a large-scale space opera, if you zoom out from an urban environment and take a look at what's going on around it. My point here is that your stories should have a setting that reinforces and amplifies your themes and doesn't clash with them, but you don't need to create a new setting for every single story genre. Instead, by adjusting time, distance, and character perspectives, one setting can encompass a multitude of themes and story genres. So for this video, I will use one specific fantasy setting, the Flying Island setting I used for the novel Skyflight, and explain how I would adapt it to tell a variety of different story genres. Let's get started. The setting basics. Before I go changing the setting, I should probably explain what I'm starting with. Not everyone has read the book Skyflight after all, although it would make me happy if you did. Anyway, the Flying Island setting takes place on a world the size of Saturn, but in this case, the planet has a breathable atmosphere and millions of solid islands that float at various altitudes. Higher islands get more sun but less rain and heat, and lower islands get less sun but more rain and heat. Below a certain altitude lie the depths, an area where no sunlight can reach and thus no plant life can survive. In particular, the setting focuses on an island called Perenella. Perenella is a relatively large island the size of Great Britain, and it's unified under an absolute monarch. Magic is real in this setting, but casting spells uses up a limited resource called Argentum. Because of this, Argentum is expensive, and its use is restricted to men and the upper class. And since magic was the only way to fly between islands until recently, contact between Perenella and other civilizations has been limited and largely peaceful. However, that's starting to change in the settings present because aircraft were recently invented. Flying with airplanes is much cheaper than flying with magic, and since lower-class women have been at the forefront of airplane piloting and development, a paradigm shift is taking place. A women's rights movement resembling that of 19th century England has developed, and the protests and counter-protests are getting violent. Aside from that, while electricity was never invented on Perenella, the island's technology otherwise resembles that of the United States right around World War I. Exploration. Exploration is what I would call the default of the Flying Island setting. In the novel Skyflight, 4 characters leave Perenella behind and survive a storm, an ambush, and a crash landing in the depths as they travel to a distant island. And along the way, they learn about themselves, their world, and the nature of feminism and misogyny. However, I've now told that story, and in my opinion, a new story about exploration should be about new people, new locations, and new aspects of the human psyche. For that reason, the sequel I've been thinking about writing would take place on a completely different part of the planet, on an island the size of Asia or the Pacific Ocean, and the people who live near the center of it don't even realize how immense their planet is. The protagonist of the story would be an adventurer from this clueless society, and his travels would resemble the episodic format of Around the World in 80 Days or Gulliver's Travels. His first set of adventures would take him to different parts of the same island, and his second set of adventures would take him over the edge. So while the general setting and the nature of magic would stay the same, the various societies and societal problems explored by the story would be completely different. Mystery. A good mystery story can exist inside almost any setting. All you really need is a sleuth or other sort of seeker of truth, an object to steal or person to murder, and a medium-sized cast of characters for the sleuth to interact with as they solve the mystery. There are certain genre expectations that were set a century ago thanks to early crime novels and hard-boiled detective stories, but they aren't really essential to the format. As it is, a mystery story would slot very nicely into my Flying Island setting. Because Perenella resembles turn of the 20th century England, I could borrow a lot of elements from the original Sherlock Holmes stories, without anything seeming out of place. And while I could focus the story on feminism again, I could also choose another societal woe that was affecting industrial societies at the time. the rise of labor unions, the tug-of-war between democracy and autocracy, issues with rapid urbanization, and so on. I would only have trouble with topics like nationalism, racism, and religious fundamentalism, since the cultural and physical isolation of Perenella have meant that those specific issues haven't really cropped up. Horror. Horror is another easy story genre to adapt for. Horror is an intensely personal experience, and one that usually involves isolation. And so all you really need is a lonely cabin in the woods or in an empty field, where help and reinforcements are miles away at best. My setting features a number of uninhabited minor islands and rogue islands, where help is hard to come by, so they would make an excellent backdrop for a horror story. Then there are the depths, a place where light is never seen, and twisted, mutated animals stalk the endless darkness. I used a few horror elements in Skyflight during the depths section, and if I had focused on them, the story could have easily joined the horror genre. However, one thing my setting doesn't have is any supernatural entities, nothing unrealistic, aside from the planet and the magic. I wouldn't want to change that just to add ghosts or zombies to a horror story, but there's still plenty you can do with creeping monsters or a passenger going crazy and murderous. Then there's the other type of horror, the apocalyptic horror, where everyone starts dying or turning into zombies or pod people. I wouldn't want to use Perenella for that kind of story, since I'd want to preserve it for future stories, but what I could do is move to a different civilized island and describe how they fall apart. Or I could have a Perenellan explorer come across a destroyed civilization and have to survive among the ruins for a time. Comedy. As with the last two genres, a good comedy can take place anywhere. In fact, it has even fewer restrictions, since a comedy can involve one person, a small group, a large group, or a whole city or country. Scale is unimportant to a comedy. All that is important is the absurdity. And while comedy can feature social commentary, it can also be a bit of light entertainment that focuses on nothing more serious than a funny person doing silly things. In the case of the Flying Islands setting, I would again use Perenella's technology era as inspiration for what kind of comedy to focus on. Specifically, the early 20th century was a time when slapstick comedy and melodramas were popular, and so I would focus the book on a character like Charlie Chaplin's The Tramp, a well-meaning and earnest but kind of slow character who keeps experiencing bad luck and unfortunate coincidences. Romance. By romance, I mean a love story that doesn't center around explicit sex scenes. I don't mean to be dismissive of those kinds of stories, but I don't have any interest nor any expertise in writing them. That being said, romance is yet another genre that you can set in front of any backdrop. Love is a universal human concept, and while different cultures have different expectations as to how a proper courtship and marriage should be conducted, a good love story should be unusual, unexpected, unpredictable. You could insert political commentary by having the two in love be on different sides of a political debate. You could insert societal commentary by having the story involve something other than the love of one man and one woman, or you could avoid heavy topics entirely, make it a romantic comedy or a romantic adventure. I mean, heck, I don't even need to explain how to fit romance into my setting. Love happens literally everywhere. Crime drama. Aside from mysteries, there are other crime dramas like heists, organized crime thrillers, police stories, and so on. Unfortunately, this is the sort of story that can be hard to translate into every setting, since you need a certain amount of urban concentration before you can expect organized crime to exist. On the other hand, urban concentration is a relative term. There is no specific number of people who have to live in a city for its criminals to organize. And for that matter, bandits and raiders tend to show up in areas with low population density. And so while I would use a city on Perenella as the host of a heist story, if I was feeling especially mad, I would move the setting clock forward a decade or two and write a story about a band of sky pirates who live on a base on a nearby minor island and raid both Perenella and the other nearby islands for loot and fuel. Revenge thriller. By revenge thriller, what I mean is the kind of story where a person is offended or harmed in some way, and goes on a roaring rampage of revenge against everyone who stands in their way. Think movies like Taken, John Wick, an alarming number of martial arts films, and more than a few westerns. Much like love, vengeance is a universal emotion. However, the nature of the setting is going to have a big impact on how the protagonist is going to get the revenge and who is going to get in their way. For instance, a medieval fantasy revenge story will most likely end with an army storming a castle, and whereas a lone samurai will cut a lot of people to pieces, a more modern-day protagonist is more likely to use a whole lot of guns. As for the Flying Island setting, I would most likely take advantage of the power of magic and the way it can make an individual far more dangerous than they would otherwise be. Magic in this setting can do a lot of impossible things, but it also depends on a finite resource, and so I can add a lot of drama to the last act of the story by having the protagonist lose their Argentum supply. War. Now this is a hard one because of how I built the setting. Nations don't go to war very often because of how isolated each island is. And while islands sometimes collide and merge or shatter and separate, the process is usually slow enough that the two sets of inhabitants can meet and intermingle before the event happens. However, I can see two good ways for me to write a war story in my setting without jumping to something so drastic. First, while external threats are minimal, internal threats are high, since Perinella's government is an absolute monarchy, and peaceful revolution is therefore impossible. The agitation surrounding women's and workers' rights could easily end up boiling over, and the whole nation could descend into a years-long civil war. Or I could jump the setting half a century forward to a time when large cargo planes and zeppelins allow for cheap and easy air transport. Suddenly, Perinella isn't so isolated, and it can begin colonizing its less advanced neighbors and competing with its more advanced neighbors. A proper war in a setting like this would be really interesting, since it would involve three-dimensional movements, constant island hopping, and non-stop dogfights. Because of this, I would probably use the Pacific theater of World War II as inspiration. Any kind of setting can tell just about any kind of story, and if you're careful about moving things around in the background, you can make sure your setting fits with your story and reinforces the themes you want to explore. And so while you can create a new setting for each story you write, you don't always have to. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.